One of the great processes I actually learned from the CEO of GoDaddy, Aman, when he brought this concept of an inception. And now I'm obsessed with them because what it does is it takes an idea and it breaks it down into work that you can execute so that everybody understands fully and they kind of do that breakdown process. But you do write epics and you write stories through that process. The thing I love about it so much is that everybody can have a different interpretation of an idea. You can all be like nodding, yes, we're on the same page. Yes, we're on the same page, but everybody has a different thing in their head. So when they go do, all of a sudden your perfectly aligned team is running in 4 different directions. I think that the writing down is so critical because it actually puts pressure on the are we saying the same thing? Did we actually mean that? Are we aligned? Because we may think we're aligned, but until you put it on paper and you actually go through it together, you don't really know.
Welcome to the Product Agility Podcast, the missing link between agile and product. The purpose of this podcast is to share practical tips, strategies, and stories from world-class thought leaders and practitioners. Why, I hear you ask? Well, I want to increase your knowledge and your motivation to experiment so that together we can create ever more successful products. My name is Ben Maynard, and I'm your host. What has driven me for the last decade to bridge the gap between agility and product is a deep-rooted belief that people and products evolving together can achieve mutual excellence. Hello, welcome back to the Product Agility Podcast. We are joined for the second and final time, not ever, maybe. And again, episode 2 takes a dark turn immediately. We are joined once again by the one and only storyteller supreme, Tara Wellington, who was in episode 1, joined us and spoke about storytelling as a product manager and shared a story from her time at GoDaddy. And since GoDaddy, you've been at PandaDoc and now you're at Bill.com as well, doing some senior product person awesomeness. And we are joined again because we are going to be talking about, at least at the beginning of this episode, user stories. User stories, I think, are one of the most misused, abused, misunderstood techniques that I think I've ever come across in my 20-odd years of working with products and tech. So I am super keen to talk to Tara because she released an article towards the beginning of this year, which was, let me see, just get the actual proper title before I make something up. Where do user stories fit in the product development process? And as part of that, you shared some common pitfalls. And this really piqued my interest because user stories aren't the most common, they're not the most common technique that you find product professionals talking about. Agile people talk about them a lot, but when you're hanging about product people, it never really bubbles to the surface. So yeah, I was intrigued, Tara, and I want to know, what was it that made you write this article for Reforge?
Yeah, so one of the great things that Reforge does is that they really listen to their audience, as all great product people do. And they kind of pulse them on what they care about and what they're interested in and what problems they have and things that come up that are concerning, or they see questions that are repeated all of the time. So this was a topic that was coming up a lot with the Reforge audience. So the reason Bruno, Divya, and I spent time talking about this is because it was something that the audience cared about. And that was why we wanted to talk to it. So it wasn't us going off and talking about, we know our teams and the product folks that report to us are misusing user stories or they're not doing things well. It was more around folks having some deep questions in the Reforge community about it.
Are they wider spread? Do you think that I perhaps gave them credit for in the introduction?
Well, I think user stories everybody knows them, right? If you're in the product world, you've come across them, whether you use them all of the time or you use them sparingly or you use them never. You've seen them, you've heard about them, they've been part of your life. Somebody you've worked with cared an awful lot about them. So I think it is important to talk about them because everybody has an opinion on it, but there's no one right way to think about it, right?
Do you know what? I hate them. Right? But bear with me on this. There's method to my abuse against user stories. I hate user stories as a thing when it's like, oh, this is a user story. Because I think that as soon as it becomes a thing that like a tangible thing you can see, I think that the power of it is lost. Right? Because at that point, it's like a small written requirement. And whilst I hate it when it becomes a thing. I love it when I think about it as a process, as a technique. And I quite enjoy things like user story mapping, because you're saying, hey, what's the story of this user when they're going to be interacting? What's the problem they're looking to solve? And I think that hearing the story of a user, I think, is really, really valuable. And I think user story mapping is a neat technique, which is quite easy for people to pick up. It's well documented. And like I say, there's a huge amount of value in that. But I hate user stories when they become just distilled down to a thing, and that's it. Because I think then you've lost the power of what was, I believe, initially, it's a technique. It isn't just an artifact.
Yeah, when we were talking about writing this story, I was actually shocked at the absolute vitriol people had about user stories. I couldn't believe how passionately people disliked them. And I think that really comes from the fact that they are misused a lot. And I think if you look at it in real world practice, it is probably really frustrating because people are they're just going through the motions, right? Here are my user stories, toss them over the wall. Here are my user stories, go work on them, right? And so they're misused so much that I think this is where this like intense reaction people have about them as a concept comes from. I think I didn't have that reaction because I like the spirit behind them, right? Even though they're misused and even though they can have this really dogmatic approach and feeling like they're very process oriented, I think the idea of making sure that the work that you're doing has a customer perspective, and I should be able to, as a customer, as whoever is in, they are part of the story, they should be able to do something so that, right? So there's a customer intent in it and there's an outcome in it. And that I think is really noble, right? We should, every time we're writing a line of code, every time we're thinking about a feature and value we're delivering, it should be attached to who we're building it for and the purpose of that work for them, right? And so I love that. I love that spirit. Now, the problem you have with that is that people are like, oh, I have a format. Let me just fill in the blank, right?
I'll put it in
They're not doing the research.
I'll put it in a spreadsheet.
Yeah,
I'll do a formula.
I'll put in my Jira ticket. And then it just becomes this thing you have to do. Or people are like, oh, let me just go write up 100 of these. And they use it as a replacement for things like really great research and really in-depth talks with their engineering team around why this matters to the customer and why this is something that's important. Or they use it to push a narrative that they care about versus something else. And so I think it's the misuse of them that is more of a problem than the actual story itself. Who cares, right?
Yeah.
Like, who cares if you're writing in this format? It's really about getting across why this work matters in a written format.
Reminds us of our previous conversation. It allows people to build empathy with the subject, whoever the subject might be, and I think whatever's written down doesn't really matter. And I think this is where sometimes when I'll make a confession. Let's begin this little section with a big confession. So when I first started working in a product role, oh my God, 15, 16 years ago, maybe. Yeah, I shouldn't have been in the role. Just shouldn't have been. But I was like the least shit person we could find to do the job. And I was working with some Scrum teams, and we were effectively going to be putting this new product into this organization. And long story short, I thought what I needed to do was write a big backlog full of user stories and hand it over to the team. And I toiled for a week, if not longer, in Jira, just writing story after story after story, using epics and it's relates to and depended on, and did all this crap. And then I sat down and the team kept saying to me, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm working on your backlog. And then when I handed it over to the team, they're like, this is absolutely useless. We've got no idea what any of this is about. And so we deleted it all, just archived all the backlog, my week of work, just chucked it all away. Because it was at that point I realized that actually the most effective way for us to build this backlog of work, given that we know what we have to do, is to let the team talk to the users and let me help them have the conversations. And they still chose to use the user story technique and the template, everything else. But my role became one of building a relationship and helping to facilitate and steering when needed, rather than being in the middle of it all.
I will say, I don't think your confession is unique. And I think that everybody, their first time they're in a product role is, what am I supposed to be doing? How did I get this job? Because you don't go to school for product. I mean, maybe now, at least when I was getting into product, you can't like graduate with a product degree. Right? So I love talking about people's background into product because everybody takes these super funky ways into it. But I did the same thing, right? When I first got into product, I was like, all right, I should be able to so that, like do the format. And because you have to fall back on structure when you're learning, because you don't know the nuances, right? Like product is this kind of like art and science coming together. And the art is something that's really hard to teach somebody, and you have to do it to like learn it and go through the motions and understand how all of these different pieces work together. But I think the user story, the story itself isn't the problem, right? Like in the piece that you just communicated, right? The fact that it was only the story is the problem. Like user stories alone don't get the job done, right? They're not an effective communication tool. They're a documentation tool. They're a process tool. So that you can say, did we do this? Did we cover this? Did we cover this? But they're not a why. They're not a supporting evidence. They're not a here's the bigger picture, right? And those things have to be communicated. You have to have conversations with your engineers and your designers and all of the folks that are working collectively on a product. So everybody has context. Everybody understands the why. They've heard the story. They've had the storytelling piece, right? And then it's like, okay, we all agree and we're all aligned. And then what are the details of what we have to do? Okay, put those in this user story. But they don't get the job done alone. And I think that's one of the biggest problems.
Now, you do say in your article, and I'm going to just glance at here whilst I read it, an anxious product lead will spend too much time trying to create the perfect user story. At the other extreme, the overzealous product lead will spend too little time articulating their thinking. I mean, brilliant quote there. I think that really brings it home. So what is thinking about the article, thinking about the 3 pitfalls that were mentioned in the article as well, then what's the middle ground then? With somebody just with little experience, understandably leaning heavily on the structure and then just trying to create the perfect user story. And then the other extreme, which is just the overzealous, maybe the slightly inflated self-worth product lead, doesn't articulate their thinking, just thinks they can just bash some stuff down and hand it over. What's the middle ground? And how do those pitfalls you mentioned in the article, how does this all come together into some success?
Yeah, I mean, like everything else in life, right? There's this moderation. So I think it's about where in the process the user stories fall, right? There is something to be said about being thorough in your requirements, right? And if you choose to use user stories, you have to make sure that they are accurately reflecting what needs to get built, right? So there absolutely is a time and a place for us to have a written record of what needs to get done in a way where we can be like, check, check, check. Yes, this is all there. But again, that's one piece of the product development puzzle, right? There's what comes before the user stories, which is the research, the understanding, the purpose, the why. What are we trying to accomplish? What are the goals that we have? How do we make sure that we're taking that, breaking it down into something we can actually build and deliver, right? that all comes before the user stories. And then there's after the user stories, right? Okay, we wrote them, we've handed them over, check, they're all done. Well, do they work together? Are they accomplishing those goals? Are they flowing together in a way that's solving the original thing we tried to solve? Are we testing them? Are we experimenting? Is this working, right? So it's a piece of a puzzle. And if you spend too much time there and deep focus on the user stories and you don't do the pre-work, that's not great. If you skip it over altogether, that the post part's going to be hard. How do you know exactly, like how is your team going to know how to get to those outcomes, how to build that experience, how to make something that reflects the needs? So there's a balance of, okay, let's not over index on them, but there has to be some written record of what we're going to go build, right? And user stories is one format. It's a very popular one. But if you have another way to do that you find this effective, sure. But don't skip that step, right?
User stories is part of the puzzle. I got to think, okay, what puzzle are we talking about here? Because I think user stories, as you articulated it then, is part of the overall kind of product journey. In a product organization, an organization which has good product mindset, product sensibilities, I think using user stories when you've got a great research happening at the front and you've got some effort afterwards, which is trying to, in some way, increase your confidence that the hypotheses that your work was based upon is actually returning the value you expected, or that there's some learning, there's something you can do with that. And I think that kind of prep work, like the research, the validation of the hypotheses, sticking user stories in that puzzle, yeah, I can see that tying together. Because it got me to thinking that perhaps part of the issue is when traditional tech mindset organizations where it's supply and demand between product and tech, or tech are kind of subservient and they're given user stories as a replacement for some other kind of specification or requirements document. The people that write on the user stories, as much as they would love to do things differently, they're just told to go and do the work and hand it over. And so I wonder, is this user stories in a product environment can be pretty sweet and can be a nice part of the picture. But when you move into a more tech-focused organization where there are silos which aren't working well together to create that holistic product and see how things come together, that's where some of the challenge of user stories comes from.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting in the companies that I've worked for, every company has great things about it and has challenges, right? And I've been in some environments which were very heavily documentation based, because it was like, write it down and give it to me and I'll go do it, right? But they were missing the communication and the talking, right? And I've been in other places that were like talked all the time and they're always chatting and this and that, but they never wrote anything down. And so it was really hard, where it was like, well, what did we agree on? What did we say? How are we going to do this? And so what you really need is, you need both, right? You need to be able to have the conversation. You need to be able to make sure everybody's on the page, have the alignment, give people a chance to discuss and ask questions and understand more deeply. And then you have to write it down. And you have to say, this is what we're going to go do. Everybody read this, make sure we're aligned. Are we all agreed? These are the things, right? And user stories are one way of documentation, of writing it down, saying, this is what we're going to go build, right? It's not the only way, but it's one way. And if people like using it and it's effective, I don't see any harm in it, as long as you're communicating and you're doing it within an overall product development lifecycle that has discovery, research, and then also iteration.
So two things pop into my head, and one short anecdote. I was working for a very large UK bank called, back then it was called the Royal Bank of Scotland, and I was a kind of touring kind of product agility coach, I suppose is the best way of putting it. And I was just kind of like, people would phone me up or send me an email, or my boss would pimp me out somewhere, and it was brilliant. I got to see all kinds of different pieces of the organization, and I got a message from someone saying, oh, can you come and spend time with our agile team? They're having problems with their user stories. Sure. So I went and sat down with them and I said, great, okay, so talk me through what you're doing. But we've got this spreadsheet and we're writing on all the user stories, and we need to get this complete and get all the user stories written. I'm like, okay, fantastic. maybe. Like, so talk me through your roles. Like, who's developer? Was testers? Like, who's a product owner? Talk me through this team. And they're like, oh no, we're all just analysts. I'm like, what do you mean? I was like, no, we're analysts. I'm like, so what happens when you've written all of these down? Oh, we're going to hand them over to the developers. I was like, have you seen other developers? Do you know them? No, they're not hired yet. Okay. And when you hand it over, are those developers going to get to like at least sit with the users? And oh well, we haven't even sat with the users. Okay. Are they going to get to sit with you to understand it? Oh no, we'll be working on the next backlog then. I was like, okay. I was like, do you think?
Panic?
Yeah, I was like, I said, with the greatest of respect, like, what's the probability of this working out, do you think? And they're like, close to 0. And I was like, wow, okay. So not even you believe this is a good idea. So the nice thing is I spoke to the program sponsor and just said, look, this will play that conversation. And they cancelled the project. And I thought that is the best decision I think you've made. But it was just crazy that people do just see it as a replacement for a requirements document. And what we're saying is that is not the case at all.
No. And I think we also have to remember that every time we're putting something out there, it's a hypothesis.
Yes.
Right? Like, we don't know if it's going to work. We have an educated guess. We've done research. We've done some things to inform ourselves, but we don't know if it's going to have the intended effect, right? And so the story is at the story level, right? It's, okay, here's what we're going to go build to test this hypothesis, right? But it should never be like, this is the end.
Yeah.
Right? Like, this set of stories is the requirements. We go build it and we're done.
Oh, because then
right? We've met the requirements.
Yeah. No, because then, sorry to interrupt and sorry to talk over. Just because all of a sudden, yes, because then you'd never need stupid conversations where people say, well, the backlog you need to make sure that the user story is up to date. Why? Well, because when it's delivered, we need something to refer back to. I'm like, well, that makes no sense. But like, why? I'm like, because what if I deliver something in this user story and then actually by the time we get down to this one, we're changing the thing we delivered then because they're incremental, like something might change. Well, that's no good, is it? Well, no, like it's that old school thinking. It's not a requirements document. It's not a specification. It's not something that you write and then you hold people to, and then you use that as your documentation for what's gone out. It doesn't. They're not designed to work in that way.
Yeah. So your backlog should be a living thing, right? It's living, breathing, changing based on your learning, based on the strategy, based on your goals, right? It's always going to be adjusting. And that's good. That's what it should be. I think there are things around tracking that can be helpful for understanding, like throughput, or understanding how often are we changing scope, or are we estimating well? And that's where it's like, okay, here's a story, here are the story points, right? Let's understand those things. But let's not hold ourselves to it in a way where it's like, well, you said to build this. Even if it's wrong, I don't care, I'm building this, right? It's that goes against everything that we're trying to do in delivering value to the customer. Because we're not delivering work to the customer. Our goal is to deliver value to the customer. And that takes learning and adjusting and iterating and trying and changing, right? And one of the things I always say is our product should be its worst the first time it goes out. And I know that drives people nuts because they're like, why would we put out something bad? And I'm like, we're not trying to put out something bad, but it should get better. It should start getting better the day it gets in customers' hands, right? You always want it to be getting better, not worse. And that's because you now have customer learnings that you can constantly be getting.
Yeah, pulling back in and weaving it through, and which is why the whole, your product work is always evolving. It's always changing. What you did now isn't. Yeah, you'll go back and change that at some point because you'll find out that actually your hypothesis was incorrect. And this then goes back to that arrogance-driven kind of approach: is to think that it's going to be, you can document this down and then deliver it and it's done, and that's exactly what it was. It's just very naive.
The only caveat I will put on that, I actually saw a great talk at I think it was a Women in Tech conference, and they were talking about the stakes of your product development.
Mm-hmm.
And they were like, look, if you're working on Postmates, it's probably different than if you're working on a self-driving car.
Yeah.
Right? The capacity for not getting it exactly right, like you have to think about your stakes. So there's a caveat.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. And
you don't want to like medical equipment or something, right?
Yeah, it is really interesting, and you're right. There is a risk-based approach to it. If this goes wrong, then what is the worst that's going to happen? Can we afford to rework this? Do we want to rework it? I think that if you're a startup or a small company with not a lot of funding or people, you want to be doing stuff that you have the highest confidence you can get away with is going to be okay, and you want to learn from that and change it. I suppose if things aren't so tight, you can afford to be a little bit more frivolous because you can afford to rework it and go back. But then there's also situations where the level of alignment on the problem you're solving and what it is you do to solve that problem is so high that you can just write a spec, or you don't have to use a user story because the alignment is there. There's no learning to be done.
Yeah. I mean, there's sometimes things where it's like, well, y'all, let's not overanalyze it. This is just a go do. People hate this.
I know.
Just go do it. But I do think I've worked in some organizations where there's this feeling that there's a lot of pressure to deliver more and more and more. And that once you finish one thing, you have to be on to the next. And there's no time for that iteration, or there's no time for that learning and improving. And that I think does get people in this fear state of like, it has to be right before it goes out because I'm never going to get a chance to work on this again. Right? And that's a scary mentality because it actually does slow you down. It prevents learning and experimentation and testing. And is where you get people going crazy over every little story because they're like, it has to be perfect. And it's never going to be, right? Like it's always a hypothesis.
And if you're spending that much time going into it, and maybe this is my experience and my bias, and I'm not saying this is a universal truth, but if you spend that much time trying to get it perfect, then I don't see how that's going to be based on actually talking to the user, because your research that you've got will go so far, and you'll have a good punt at it, and then you want to go deeper and deeper and deeper. It gets to a point where you're just fabricating stuff to try and fit into it, surely, and then you're getting further away from the probability that it's going to pay off. Yeah. There was one of the pitfalls mentioned in the article, which was fabricating user story to force fit into a product hypothesis. What was meant by that?
I think this one is that people are holding too tightly on to what they think is right. And so, again, they're using the user story to force something to work when maybe it's not the best decision, right? But I think it comes back to the conversation we had earlier of a static backlog and not listening to the feedback and not being able to adjust when you have learnings and when you have other pieces coming in.
Yeah, I mean, could that be when there's work which someone feels needs to be done, but doesn't perhaps align to the goal you're currently working on? So they're trying to shoehorn it into that current objective.
Yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned earlier that user stories are one way to do this. I'm wondering if you could never use the user story technique again, what are some other techniques or some other ways of kind of capturing this information that you would find useful?
Yeah, so we've been doing a lot of written form, like long form written documents at my last two companies that give a lot more context in the documentation. So we had talked about the user stories in the middle, the context for it, and like the iteration work after. If all of that context is written down and documented in a way that it can travel, it's not always in the storytelling format, but it's fully embedded in all the pieces, then you can have like a much more narrative structure rather than just like the hit bullets. But I think it depends on your organization and how async they want to work and their time and capacity to read and absorb that way versus having like time carved out to have the discussion and then have a more succinct way to hit through the work that we want to get done. So that's one way. Another way, in like a very creative setting, right? You could pose, instead of as the PM coming up with the requirements, right? And writing the user stories, and even with all of the context, still handing over some documentation of it or writing the Jira stories out. You could have more of a live session where you're saying, okay, well, we want to do this. And we think that this, you're kind of talking through user stories, but you just sort of do it that way as more collaborative versus this documentation of user stories and writing it all up. You still have to document it some way.
Yeah. And I think that's one important thread that I'm noticing what you're saying, and this aligns to what I think is correct as well, is that we're not talking about with anything user story or collaboration is just talking. And we're not saying it's just writing stuff down. There is a balance to be struck between talking and writing. And if it's important to write down because you're going to forget it, then absolutely document it. But it shouldn't be then in place of the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think writing it down is really critical. One of the great processes I actually learned from the CEO GoDaddy, Aman, when he came to GoDaddy. He brought some team members with him, and they brought this concept of an inception, which I had never done before. And now I'm obsessed with them, because what it does is it takes an idea and it breaks it down into work that you can execute, right? So it's really good at taking a strategy or a concept or a process and breaking it down so that everybody understands fully, and they do that breakdown process. But you do write epics and you write stories through that process. And the thing I love about it so much is that everybody can have a different interpretation of an idea. And so you can all be like nodding, yes, we're on the same page. Yes, we're on the same page. But everybody has a different thing in their head. So when they go do, all of a sudden your perfectly aligned team is running in 4 different directions, right? And so I think that the writing down is so critical, because it actually puts pressure on them. Are we saying the same thing? Did we actually mean that? Are we aligned? Because we may think we're aligned, but until you put it on paper and you actually go through it together, you don't really know, right? Because people interpret things in very different ways. Even the term user stories, you probably got 5 people thinking of different things right in their head.
I mean, is that not then just the crux of it? Is that we've all got different mental models, values, beliefs, biases, right? The things that make it up, how we see the world. And actually some of this is what tools can we use to help articulate our perception of some information to which we're supposed to be processing? And because we're all going to be processing it differently. Sometimes we get it absolutely bang on and we all agree without there being any extra effort required. Often turns out that we're actually on different sides of the globe in our understanding of a particular word or phrase. And it's what can we do to get something down in front of people, whether it's a picture, whether it's telling a story, picture, written story, something written down. So there's something to base that on.
Yeah. And it's really critical because, harking back to the conversation we had about storytelling, everybody has a different thing they care about, and they're all going to see what you're talking about from the lens of, this is what I care about. And if somebody's, I care about speed, I care about quality, I care about the design consistency, I care about the user value, right? They're all going to be like, how can I get what I care about out of this thing? And if you don't all agree on paper on exactly what that thing is, it can get kind of messy, right? And I've been in so many situations where that exact thing happens, and then I get annoyed. I'm like, a week ago we were all aligned. What happened? Like, how are we in this position? Didn't we all agree on this? And everyone's, yes, but you didn't tell me this thing. You didn't say you were going to do this, right? And that's where the articulation of the details in some sort of format like user story helps put pressure on it.
Yeah, it's that journey to ensure alignment and to flush out the inconsistencies, right? I mean, we're only human. There's a game, and it's a game and exercise that I play in some of my courses, and I did it this week with a really large UK broadcaster called Channel 4, working with their social media teams, like not tech. I mean, you think if their product, I mean, they're releasing, I would say their product is almost every short clip they've released across all the different platforms. And this team have been incredibly successful. They've had more hours, I think more minutes of their content watched on Facebook than there are people in the world. They are phenomenally productive. I'm getting like billions and billions of minutes of their shorts they've created have been watched from their just pumping out on social media networks. It's fascinating, like a really high-paced, responsive environment. And I did this exercise with them where they had to. I gave them a really simple picture and they had to write out a specification for the picture. And then write a specification out, give it to someone else, and they had to basically carry out the specification and draw the picture. And people are more successful than they thought. And the second time around, they get to sit next to each other, and the person who's drawing is taking verbal instructions and feedback. And the whole idea of it isn't that writing stuff down is wrong and that everything has to have a verbal conversation. It's actually they realise that there's a huge amount of benefit in having a little bit of something written down, so at least it's framed and then people can understand it. But then actually working with someone to have the conversation and get some feedback to make sure that you are aligned. Because when I did this in the course, and a good friend of mine called Ben, not me, and another Ben, took the picture, and on the picture there's 6 different shapes. And he wrote, I believe it's what he wrote, draw a rectangle, and inside the rectangle there'll be 6 figures. And he meant like there's just 6 objects. And the rest of his handwriting, I'm not sure how legible it was, because what the person drew was effectively it looked like an American football team. Because they took it as figures, meaning people. And just drew these people, and I thought it's just amazing how how the single word it gets interpreted is so wildly different. And if you had to wait a month, 2 months to see that, then who knows what position we'll be in? But actually, getting that quick feedback is important. I think that's if I'm taking anything away from this, Tara, is that it's documentation and it's conversation, and it's making sure that mental models are aligned so that we don't end up with unpleasant surprises.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now we are almost at time. And I would love to know, Tara, what has been your favourite moment of the last 2 episodes?
Oh, can we now talk about the segues?
We can talk about the segues, because then they can't leave the edit, can they?
Well, obviously the segues. No, I liked how the user story discussion really became a conversation of communication and documentation and the balance of that. Because I think it's really critical, and companies have a culture that oftentimes leans one way or the other. And I think as product leaders and product folks, like one of our key roles is to make sure that that's balanced. Like, how can we do that in an effective way?
Beautiful. Thank you, Tara. It's been such a treat to have you on. Even though this is our second attempt, because we did try and record an episode way back when, months and months ago, and it was all set up.
Yeah.
Was it July? Yeah, I was in a fancy location. I'd hired a special podcast and recording studio, and my laptop wouldn't let me record it. So we had a lovely warm-up conversation, and then didn't record a second of actual content. So it's just so great to have you here. And you've got such an interesting career, and these episodes could have absolutely been about a number of other things, right? Because you are a font of knowledge and experience. And personally, I would have loved to have delved into some of the Panda Docs times, but I think maybe that's a conversation for when I come over to New Hampshire and avoid bears one day.
Yeah, there you go. You're welcome anytime.
Can drink pumpkin beer.
Yeah, pumpkin beer and bears. That's a great, and segues. It's a great introduction to New Hampshire.
There we go. So thank you so much, Tara.
This was fun.
It was fun. And one day I'd love to do this in person. I can learn a lot from you. So thank you so much for your time and your patience, because I'm sure that the bloopers won't make it into this episode, but a few things happened along the way.
That was great.
And never with anyone else, and I mean that. So Tara, thank you so much. Have a fantastic rest of your day. Everybody, thank you very much for listening, and we'll welcome you back again next week. Thank you, Tara.
See ya. Bye.
See ya. Don't stop listening yet. Tara had a lot of great things to say, but I've got a few things to add. First of all, Tara is a legend. I'd recommend checking her out wherever you can do. Maybe the previous episode where we spoke about storytelling. Maybe you want to re-listen to this episode because of all the golden nuggets that were exhumed from the earth when it came to looking at documentation versus verbal communication. But the thing I really wanted you to hang around for is to share this little tidbit. We have got a gentleman named Nigel Baker coming on for 2 episodes. Now, Nigel is someone that has been around in the product and agile world for many, many years. He's an extraordinarily funny and engaging chap. He has a huge love for all things 1980s and retro. So if you ever want a conversation about the A-Team, he's your man. He joined me for 2 episodes, and I have to apologise to Nigel because it's taken us a little while to get these episodes out. So I'm really excited because Nigel, he precedes himself. I think that was a compliment. He is funny, he is engaging, he has got so much character and some strong opinions, and it was a joy to have him on. So you're going to really love listening to him next week. So without any further ado, I'll let you get on with your day, finish off your walk, your run, whatever it is you happen to be doing, by saying I am Ben Maynard, and this is the Product Agility Podcast.